This is the fourth lecture for Section 2, The Road to World War II. So let's take a quick review when it comes to Soviet communism. Now remember, communism itself is a theory that advocates the elimination of private property as a system in which goods are commonly owned and available to all as needed. Remember, underline that word all. We know that it was manifested in two ways, and both of these will end up failing due to human shortcomings. Now, the first one is Karl Marx's theory that humanity would one day achieve this system through its basic evolution. He actually is going to create his own little commune, which, of course, after 20 years falls apart because the people do not basically get along and they don't want to share power. And he realizes because of that failure that humanity is not at the evolutional point that communism could work. And he himself believes it's going to be several thousand more years before human beings could even contemplate the concept of communism as a social system. Vladimir Lenin, on the other hand, is under the belief that maybe if the government controls society to the point of creating a communistic uh, set of values and social norms that maybe they could quote unquote kickstart communism into effect. This means, though, that it's not a true communism because you have a leadership, you have a higher class, and not everyone will be considered equal. And this is now the Soviet Union that we see moving into World War II. And it is the Soviet Union that emerged from World War I. Now, when it comes to socialism, we're looking at the political and economic theory of social organization. And this advocates the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be regulated by the community as a whole. So that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is equal. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be kumbaya kind of a situation that communism tends to hint towards. No, this is kind of an answer to the flaws within capitalism, that we want agencies, we want the government to some extent to regulate how businesses operate so that the needs and the rights of the workers and the society as a whole are protected. Now, we find socialism very common in European countries, usually in the form of government regulations that tend to limit a company's independence. Another term that we're going to look at is battlefront. Now, the battlefront is the furthest position that a military has reached and where an enemy is or may be engaged. So this is where the two armies are going to meet and duke it out. Now, it is possible to have multiple battlefronts, but understand the basic rule of good combat or good strategy is that you should never be fighting a war on two fronts. It is just too difficult. The focus should always be on one front. Unfortunately, what we're going to find as we move into World War II, and again, we kind of saw this with World War I, that some countries are going to face multiple fronts. With World War II, we're going to see Germany fighting on multiple fronts. Even the United States is going to be fighting on two fronts, one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic. Operational fronts are not necessarily where you see active engagement with the enemy, but they are definite areas that are going to tax a military's resources, the military's focus, or the military's priorities. And sometimes they require just as much personnel and logistics as an actual battlefront itself. And this is going to come into importance when we talk about Germany and one of the reasons why it was going and did lose the war. So let's look at three terms that at one point were even confusing to me because it's about degrees of horribleness. The first one is an authoritarian kind of government, which is a dictatorial government that requires a complete submission of the people at the expense of their freedoms in order to ensure a regime's political control. Now, these regimes tend to use oppressive and push kind of an intolerance towards any views or practices except those that are espoused by the state. And these regimes use coercive measures such as censorship and domestic terrorism in order to maintain the political control. So we're kind of looking at this is a horrible light. The next would be a totalitarianism government, which seeks complete individual control of the state. Now, while an authoritarianism or authoritarian government concentrates on political control, a government that is totalitarianistic in nature extends its control to all aspects of life, including ideology, culture, and individual thought. And when we talk about fascism, we're kind of seeing that fascism builds upon the authoritarian and the totalitarian governments. And it moves forward by focusing on a specific ideology that tends to emphasize nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of the state over the individual. So, with those terms in mind, let's look at three of the biggest figures of the period that are going to push the world and eventually the United States into World War II. These individuals are going to use the anger and desperation that we see created by World War I and the Great Depression in order to gain the support of the people, all that temporarily. Several governments struggled with political infighting and economic crises, making them vulnerable for these kind of extremist movements. Fascism and Nazism offered a powerful narrative of national revival, order, and strength that promised to restore national pride and prosperity to not only Germany, but to Italy, and we'll also see this applied to countries like Japan and Russia. Several countries skillfully used propaganda to exploit the widespread fears and anxiety of the people, and they tended to blame scapegoats, such as, in the case of Germany, the Jews, for the nation's problems. The employment of violence and intimidation to silence opposition and to consolidate their power tended to ensure the rise of these charismatic figures. The first of the tyrants to come into power was Italy's Benito Mussolini in 1922. Mussolini will gain national attention as a socialist journalist before he went on to become the editor of several newspapers. Using Italy's political and economic turmoil, he exploited the people using calls for nationalism, political violence, and intimidation. In 1922, in what was known as the March on Rome, he pressured King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint him as prime minister. And ironically, we're going to find that his actions are going to serve as an inspiration to Adolf Hitler and his political coup in Germany. In 1929, we'll see the rise of Joseph Stalin, who worked his way into power within the Soviet Union. Now, he was never considered a possible candidate because, for the most part, he was disliked by most of the major players within the Soviet political system. However, using his mundane administrative role as a general secretary of the Communist Party, he consolidated his power through backroom deals, corruption, and violence. And more so than Mussolini, Stalin will use intimidation, fear, and violence not just to control the people, but all of those around him, no matter where they were within the political hierarchy. Though we'll see that Adolf Hitler aligns himself with socialism, he will not be a socialist leader. With only 33% of the German votes by 1933, Adolf Hitler did not appear to be the possible candidate or maintain any possible role as a political dominant character in Germany. However, in a very close election, the German Conservative Party promises him an important position if he backs their party. And as a reward for their win, he is given the chancellery. But many see him as someone that they can easily manipulate, a puppet they can control behind the curtain. In actuality, he is anything but. And in a political climate of apathy, over the next couple of months, he takes control of the government and the country through acts of deception, intimidation, and outright violence, and will become Germany's absolute power for the next 5 to 6 years, despite the fact that the country had once been a advent democratic system. Despite their long-established sense of distrust, the United States and Japan sustained a mutually beneficial economic relationship. Looking to expand their profits, U.S. companies supplied Japan with critical resources such as oil, fuels, various ores, and rubber, despite knowing that these resources were allowing the Japanese to build up their military. As the empire's military buildup gained momentum, ironically, it became far more dependent upon the United States. And we're going to find that the U.S. also became dependent on Japan as the profits lessened the effects of the Great Depression. However, diplomatic and commercial tensions are going to begin to grow between the two countries after the United States invaded Manchuria in 1931. And as the Sino-Japanese conflict escalated, we'll see that Franklin Delano Roosevelt will be compelled to consider sanctions against Japan. By 1936, Japan, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union were engaged in aggressive military actions worldwide. Italy invaded Ethiopia and sought to take over Greece, while Germany moved troops into Germany's former Rhineland against the treaty stipulations of World War I. Across the world, Japan continued its military operations in China, with its eyes on other Asian countries. Though Stalin was not seeking to expand Soviet influence into Europe at that point, we'll see that Stalin focused his attention inward as he enacted the USSR's Great Purge. In November of 1936, recognizing their shared desire to expand their influence throughout the world, Hitler and Mussolini created the Rome-Berlin Axis. Now, this pact was initially based on political interests, but later evolved into a military alliance formalized by the Pact of Steel in 1939. We'll see Mussolini use the term Axis as he declared that the world would rotate around the powers of Germany and Italy. We need to keep in mind that the effects of the Great Depression and the national memory of the tragic and massive losses experienced during the First World War will cause a vast majority of Americans to advocate for a renewed policy of isolationism. Mirroring the sentiments of their constituents, Congress pushed through a series of laws known as Neutrality Acts starting in 1935. These acts sought to restrict the country's involvement in the expanding global chaos. Unfortunately, we're going to find that these policies also serve to restrict the U.S. military's expansion and modernization at a time when other countries were starting to expand their military capabilities on either side of this growing conflict. As a result, the U.S. Army remained ranked 17th in the world in 1939. For the most part, it consisted of only 184,126 active duty personnel, and they lacked many of the standard weaponizations and systems seen around the globe. Though not as limited in numbers as the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy lacked the technical capabilities to compete with its rivals. Most of their ships were remnants of World War I. And for the most part, the United States was caught in violation of the earlier principle of military development, where a country that fell behind its rivals by 20 years of modernization is going to suffer consequences. And we see this with the United States as it continued to focus on its economy while other Western nations modernized and expanded their militaries. In the 1940 presidential election, FDR won his third term by defeating Republican Wendell Willkie, marking his second major landslide victory. With the 1940 election, he became the first U.S. president to serve more than 2 terms in office. Many were concerned that he broke with Washington's set tradition of serving only 2 terms, and that it served as a breakdown in the limitations of the executive branch. But we need to note that at this time in U.S. history, there was no constitutional mandate that limited the terms of a president. His win resulted from the support he gained from his successful, though misleading, success in walking the country back from the Great Depression. Remember that the gains of the United States towards ending its depression and rolling back the economic crisis were based on the perception of improvement, not necessarily the reality. It will be World War II, more so than Roosevelt's actions, that would be the primary contribution to the Great Depression's termination. We're going to find during this period, despite Mussolini's initial place of inspiration and power, that by 1940, Adolf Hitler has assumed the position as the primary leader of the German-Italian alliance. Disregarding Hitler's stated dislike of Eastern Europeans, a coalition with Hitler allowed Stalin to share in the occupation of Germany's invasion of Poland. Later, the alliance gave Stalin total control of Finland, Lithuania, and Estonia. By the end of 1940, German armies occupied Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France. While although plagued with difficulties, Italy occupied much of northern Africa, while England, the last great European power, found itself alone in the war against the Axis powers. In the United States, in 1933, Nazi Deputy Fuhrer Rudolf Hess orchestrated the formation of an American Nazi organization. By 1936, the German-American Bund actively sought to promote a favorable view of Nazi Germany within the United States. They recruited American citizens of German descent and other supporters to advocate for a tighter alliance between the United States and Nazi Germany. During this period, the American Bund is going to bring in thousands of Americans, and we'll see that it is attempting to create a Nazi-like world in the United States of America. However, the American Bund would be disbanded in 1941 following Germany's declaration of war on the United States. If you want to see this video and you cannot pick it up from here, there are links to this in Canvas. Here with this video that you can also find in Canvas, we find the opposite side. The organizations and government institutions that were fighting against the spread of Nazism in the United States. And understand, it's not just the American Bund, but there are other Nazi organizations that are starting to grow within the United States. Some of them latching on to previous organizations like the KKK. And again, we see this as being kind of that proof that the United States is an extremely complex country that sometimes defies a specific label. We're going to see that it is mixed with different views, different attitudes, and sometimes its population are going two completely different directions at the same time. Facing Germany alone, Britain feared its collapse after French and British troops failed to defend Dunkirk, France. With France in the hands of the Germans, the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, built numerous air bases along the French coast, and it would be from these bases that German fighters and bombers attacked England throughout its southern region in both daily and nightly raids. England found itself defending its homeland while also trying to protect its Atlantic and Mediterranean shipping. We'll also find the British in North Africa defending its oil-rich territories from Italian attacks. Thus, it makes sense that Prime Minister Winston Churchill urged FDR to enter the war, or at the very least, provide aid to the beleaguered Britain. For the most part, we'll find that FDR understood this. He comprehended the significant possibility that the U.S. was at risk from Nazi expansion. And we'll see him seek loopholes in the laws to assist England, despite many in Congress who still supported the Neutrality Acts. On September 2nd of 1940, President Roosevelt signed the Destroyer for Bases Agreement. Now, this deal allowed the United States to give the British more than 50 obsolete destroyers while gaining a 99-year lease on territory in the Newfoundland and in the Caribbean. By allowing the president to transfer war material to the beleaguered Britain without any payments, the Destroyers for Bases deal did not violate the Neutrality Act of 1939, and it also skirted the thorny problems of war debts that we had to deal with that following World War I. The U.S. control of these new locations allowed the U.S. Navy to build air stations that would be operated jointly by the U.S. Air Forces, both the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces, along with the Royal Air Forces, with the intention to hunt German U-boats with the idea of protecting U.S. and British shipping. As with the actions of President Wilson in the First World War, this arrangement signaled to Adolf Hitler that the U.S. was truly no longer a neutral player in this growing conflict. On September 27th of 1940, Japan, Germany, and Italy agreed to provide mutual assistance should any of the signatories suffer an attack by a nation not already involved in the war. As such, the pact was aimed at one particular country, as the only holdout in the conflicts remained the United States. The Tripartite Pact aimed to prevent the U.S. from becoming involved in the conflict any further than it already was, as it would face a two-front war, which, as stated earlier, is basically considered a significant problem for any country at the time. Remember the problems that came along with the Schieffelin Plan, in which Germany enacted and started World War I. Now, this pact failed as the U.S. responded with a series of embargoes on Japan and later increased its aid to Britain and the recently invaded Soviet Union, while also strengthening its military with the Two-Ocean Navy Act and the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. It's important to keep in mind that the new Axis military alliance significantly overshadowed the combined military capabilities of both the United States and the United Kingdom at this point in time. Following the Destroyers for Bases and the Tripartite, and while still playing within the loopholes of the Neutrality Acts, Roosevelt proposed a new initiative known as Lend-Lease. Now, this policy aimed to support countries fighting against the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany, while the U.S. remained, quote unquote, officially neutral by transferring, remember, not selling, weapons, ammunition, food, and other supplies to nations deemed vital to U.S. security. Thus, the United States lent supplies to the British by deferring all payments, as the United States would not insist on immediate payment. Countries like China and later the USSR gained assistance through the Lend-Lease Act in their defense against Axis powers. After its March 1941 ratification, the Lend-Lease Act played a critical role in keeping the Allies supplied and fighting, particularly before the U.S. officially entered the war. And as a result of the act, the Axis powers now targeted the United States as an enemy combatant. Reading the writing on the wall, President Roosevelt slowly sought and gained the support needed to rebuild the country's failing land, sea, and air forces in 1938. However, starting so late in the conflict left the United States military at a disadvantage as it lagged well behind the belligerents of the European and Asian conflicts. At this point, the United States lacked the technology, personnel, leadership, and experience we see in England, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the United States War Department anticipated that even with the buildup, it would not be active until 1943, when it could achieve technical equality with its allies and adversaries. However, it was noted that its lack of experience and leadership would be a significant weakness. It would not be until late 1944 or early 1945 that the US might be able to challenge the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan on a level greater than what these three countries were able to put out. Unfortunately, the world's events would not give the United States the 5 nor even the 7 years it needed to catch up. As the world entered 1941, Adolf Hitler's forces spread throughout Western and Eastern Europe, as well as Africa and the Middle East. Hitler found himself committing his limited troops to assisting the failed Italian operations in North Africa and Greece. At the same time, Germany continued U-boat attacks on English shipping and its attacks on English cities, industries, and shipping. In the early months of 1941, the attempted invasion of Britain failed, and Hitler shifted his focus to his surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. And this takes place on June 22nd of 1941. Despite the reduced attacks, Winston Churchill continued to advocate for the U.S. to join the war against Germany. By mid-1941, Hitler and his military were displaying signs of confusion and chaos as they encountered problems with overstretched logistical systems and infighting among his generals. It is becoming clear that Hitler at this point and through his micromanagement of German operations, is starting to take a negative effect on German military operations. And this will have a dire effect for Hitler and Germany from this point on throughout the war. It's important to understand that Hitler misunderstood his early successes and their unique conditions as a sign of his superiority, not the poor state of his enemies. Primarily, he failed to understand the logistics of war, which proved his ultimate undoing. When Hitler expanded his conquest to France, England, and the Soviet Union, his operations began to exceed Germany's limited resources. It is important to remember that the more territory Germany occupied, the fewer troops and supplies it had to secure their gains and to also continue the new conquests. At the same time he sought to control Europe, Hitler also sought to control the Atlantic trade routes and continued to assist Italy in North Africa and Greece. We're going to find that over time, Germany's military and the country itself lacked access to these critical resources such as oil, metals, and labor, all of which it needed to function throughout the war. Much like what the U.S. did during the Vietnam War / conflict, we're going to see that Hitler, in order to reduce the anxiety of his German citizens, maintained peacetime levels of industrial production until about 1943, 1944, well too late in the war to really make any difference. Now, if you're confused, wartime production would mean the kind of production we are already seeing in the United States. The shift of factories to focus on trying to build as many weapons and their supporting equipment as possible. Hitler, instead, up until 1943 through 1944, was trying to keep this low key so that his people would not feel the anxieties or the burden of going into war. And again, while the rest of the world was building up, he wasn't. And this is going to be a major problem for him as the war continues. With the initiation of the American and British One Conference, or ABC-1, the U.S. abandoned all notions of neutrality in the growing conflict. ABC-1 started on January 29th of 1941 and ended on March 27th, and it represented the first official talks related to the United States entering the war. By the end of the conference, the United States had committed to a Europe First strategy, with the first obligation being the protection of sea lanes and communication between the Allied powers. The U.S. military's Rainbow Plan 5 assigned the majority of the U.S. limited supplies and resources to the European conflict and directed their Pacific forces to operate under a secondary defensive role. It was determined that the Pacific forces stationed in California, Hawaii, and the Philippines must wait until 1943 to go on the offensive should Japan initiate the war, when the buildup was complete and the needed ships and logistics were ready to fully engage the possible Japanese threat. Through the ABC-1 meetings, England transferred all material related to their developing technology to the United States, as it feared their most significant scientific and engineering work might fall into the hands of the Germans. The United States and numerous British scientists and engineers continued the research and development of new technologies and weapon systems within the safety of the United States. The shared technology and knowledge allowed the United States to catch up with its allies after the critical lost time and research which resulted from its self-inflicted period of isolationism. With the influx of information, the United States is now becoming a critical asset to the war against the Axis powers, though it remains well behind its allies and adversaries in military strength. The material transferred included radar technology, jet propulsion, and mainly, or more importantly, atomic weapon research. This exchange was vital, and through Allied technological cooperation, ultimately the Allies overwhelmed the Axis powers. Like Germany, Japan lacked the natural and raw resources necessary to sustain its industry and thus its military. After the Tripartite Pact, relations between the United States and the Japanese Empire neared collapse, resulting in the loss of U.S. exports of metal, rubber, and other key resources. However, it's important to keep in mind that the United States continued to supply Japan with oil. By January of 1941, Japan was already anticipating expanding its war to the United States and Great Britain, and they were planning to do this through a surprise attack against the United States, much like it did to Russia in 1903. In mid-1941, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, and this allowed the Imperial Japanese Army to focus on China. And at the same time, the Imperial Navy began to seriously look towards the resource-rich territories of the United States and England throughout Southeast Asia. On July 24th of 1941, Japanese troops invaded southern Indochina, resulting in the U.S. freezing Japanese assets in American banks and imposing an oil embargo. Japan must now use its oil reserves, which will last only 2 years at the most, and this is even if it rations the fuels to its citizens. To further restrict Japanese military operations, the growing alliance enacts the American, British, Chinese, Dutch embargo, or as it was called, the ABCD line, which involved a coordinated effort to limit Japan's access to critical resources. With this, Japan ultimately commits to an attack upon the United States' naval assets in Hawaii and throughout the Pacific. And there will be many throughout the Japanese military and throughout their government who will openly question the logic of attacking the United States, but they will not stop the operation. And this is more because of Japanese culture, where it is okay to privately and amongst yourselves question the power and the actions of the government, but once on the actual government floor, once you are in official capacity, to question anything that Japan was wanting to do, to question the emperor, was to some extent a traitorous action because you were doubting the capabilities of the Japanese empire itself. As we see from this map, in violation of the most important role of modern warfare, Japan focuses on building warships but does not increase its small number of logistical ships. With so much territory under its control over a large area of the Pacific Ocean, and with the desire to expand even further, it needs ships to keep its forces well supplied. It is this ignorance of the importance of logistics in modern warfare which will become the main weakness, as I stated before, for Germany, but also for Japan. As stated earlier, with U.S. embargoes, Japan maintained less than 2 years of fuel reserves for its military operations, placing its entire military strategy at risk of collapse. The war in China is going very badly for Japan, leading to the rationing of food and other material for its civilian population because its industry cannot meet the demands of both the military and civilians. Admiral Ishiro Yamamoto maneuvers himself to become the chief strategist in planning and executing the war against the United States and England. Lacking an established Pacific strategy against the United States, Yamamoto chooses to disregard Japan's previous military tactics employed against Russia in 1903 and actually take the war to the United States, rather than trying to figure ways to bring the United States to Japan. Yamamoto believed with the poor state of the U.S. military in 1941, FDR's focus on Europe, and the strength of the American isolationist movement, that the United States would view an attack on the Pacific assets as an unwelcome diversion and a massive blow to U.S. morale. If Japan could inflict a significant blow to the Pacific fleet at Pearl Harbor, in Guam, and Wake Island, as well as assets in the Philippines, Yamamoto perceived that he could secure 6 months to a year for not only invading U.S. and British territories, but also securing them from future attempts by allies to regain what they had lost. Now, he hoped that in the face of such well-entrenched Japanese defenses, the massive losses might demoralize the American public further, and without the support of the American people, and considering the demands in Europe, FDR would have no other option but to sue for peace with Japan. We need to keep in mind that for Japan, this is a reasonable strategy against the United States if they could avoid any deviations. Unfortunately for Japan, over time, they will fail to limit their actions to that specific plan and expanded their operations throughout the Pacific, thus mimicking the mistakes made by Germany. In what the Japanese called Operation AI, AI meaning Hawaii, on December 7th of 1941 at 7:55 a.m., three groups of Japanese aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers stationed north of the Hawaiian Islands caught the American military in Hawaii completely by surprise. Focusing primarily on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, the Japanese rendered the U.S. air bases incapable of defending the island's skies while striking the ships sitting in Pearl Harbor. This attack overwhelmed U.S. defenses for about 15 critical minutes, and almost an hour later we'll find a second wave of 3 groups of aircraft struck again as the first wave returned to their carriers. In the end, the American military and civilian casualties consisted of 2,388 dead and 1,178 wounded. 300 military aircraft were destroyed, and 21 ships suffered moderate to complete damage. Within the following days, the United States lost key Pacific assets with the Japanese invasions of Guam and Wake Island. Weeks later, the Philippines was well underway to being under Japanese control. Americans were shocked at the news, but rather than experience a drop in morale, the American people rallied in support of going to war. And we'll find that within hours of the attack, the isolation movement lost nearly all of its supporters. Yamamoto not only miscalculated the response of the American public to the attack, but he also overestimated the success of his operations against the United States. despite acknowledging likely shortcomings throughout Pearl Harbor's planning stages. The ships that were sunk while moored in the harbor rested in the shallow 60-foot deep floor of the harbor, thus allowing the sunken ships to be raised quickly. The only exceptions included the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, which were too damaged to be salvaged. It is critical to know that these ships were to be decommissioned because they were too old for future naval operations with the modernized vessels under construction. Furthermore, as the Japanese failed to attack the repair facilities, the U.S. Navy was able to make rapid repairs on damaged ships, and the ships that were too severely damaged were patched up and then sailed to larger facilities in California. We're going to find that in the end, less than 2% of the entire U.S. Pacific naval forces spread throughout the Pacific suffered damage in the attack. It should also be noted that the weakness of the U.S. Navy in the first years of the war were related to its poor state of logistics and equipment, not the attack on Pearl Harbor. Although the Japanese proved, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, that the aircraft carrier would be the new apex of naval warfare, ironically, the Japanese refused to recognize the shift in naval strategy that led them to remain focused on battleships, much to their own detriment. This was evident at Pearl Harbor as the strikes focused on U.S. battleships and failed to seek out the carriers. Whether through chance or negligence, the Japanese missed the far more critical target, the U.S. aircraft carriers. At the time of the attack, the U.S. Pacific carriers were not in Pearl Harbor, although two were within range of the Japanese fleet. If they had launched a second attack, it is essential to understand that even if they had caught the U.S. carriers in the harbor or outside the islands, it is likely that the attack would not have been successful. Fearing the chance of U.S. submarine attacks at night, the strike force chose to return home rather than search for the missing carriers. And this will be a conflict throughout Japanese leadership, as many are going to blame the leader of the attack, Nagumo, for failing to remain in the Hawaiian waters to launch a second attack the next day. One of the final mistakes for the Japanese was failing to attack the fuel storage facilities, even though these storage structures were open and easy targets. If destroyed, the entire U.S. fleet would have needed to retreat to California, and this retreat may have resulted in the extension of the war in the Pacific by another year, which is exactly what Admiral Yamamoto wanted. However, much like Germany, Japan displayed its lack of understanding of the true nature of modern warfare. They once again ignored the importance of logistics, focusing instead on weapon systems rather than the demands of keeping them functional throughout a long-term war. This ignorance will be significant in the collapse of both Japan and Germany strategies. More so for Japan than for Germany, the Japanese military's culture code of Bushido also played a significant role in their defeat. We find that the fanaticism of the culture left no room for mistakes or opportunity to learn from them, while also focusing on the constant aggression rather than cautious actions. On December 8th of 1941, British declared war on Japan, and 3 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States, even though he was not obligated to do so under the Tripartite Act, as Japan attacked the United States, not the other way around. As such, Germany was not bound by the pact. The declaration of war against the United States comes at a time when England and Russia are close to collapse and in need of the United States' industrial capabilities. Although weak in December of 1941, the United States was less than 2 years away from closing the military gap and thereafter overwhelming its enemies. Keep in mind, though, When it comes to the European theater, it is the United States industrial might that is the greatest contribution, not necessarily its military involvement. We find that the USSR will be the most significant contributor to Germany's military defeats, not the United States or Britain. And we're also going to find that despite years of distrust and hatred, the United States and the Soviet Union allied with England against Germany. The once reviled Joseph Stalin became Uncle Joe to the American public as the U.S. attempted to accept this tense relationship. Remember the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the question as to how long that would last was in the back of everyone's mind throughout the war. The major irony for the Axis leaders was that if Japan had not attacked the United States, and if Germany had not declared war against the United States, the war would have ended with a much different outcome, possibly in favor of the Axis powers. If Japan had focused on non-American territories, leaving Hawaii, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam alone, the United States would have likely not entered the war as early as it did, or maybe even at all. Using the disinterest of the American public in its favor, Japan could have found the freedom it desired in the Pacific. By attacking the United States, it not only changed the war in the Pacific, but also in the Atlantic and throughout Europe, thus proving to be a major mistake for Hitler too. Now, if Germany had not declared war on the United States, there would have been time for Germany to ensure the collapse of either Britain or the USSR, as each country was close to collapse at this point. It is likely that at some point the United States and Germany would have gone to war, but it may have been at a point where it was too late to save the other two countries, leaving the United States on the defensive. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. allotted $100 billion towards the war effort, and this exceeded the total production of all previous American wars. Once failed factories reopened to accommodate the military's demands, and like in World War I, the labor unions agreed to avoid strikes and endure difficult work conditions should the companies provide adequate compensation. The American West Coast experienced massive growth as it became the staging point for the Pacific War. The American South hosted 60 of the 100 U.S. military bases, and we'll find that the war finally brought the South out of its agricultural focus as thousands of sharecroppers abandoned their plots to work in factories or serve in the military. As in World War I, Americans were once again encouraged to make numerous sacrifices for the greater needs of the war through the rationing of food, fuel, and other materials. Even silk was rationed as it became the primary material for parachutes, thus denying American women access to traditional wedding dresses. Even nylon stockings were banned as the material was used for tents, mosquito netting, and flak jackets. The people were again encouraged to buy war bonds to help the military. However, unlike World War I, major U.S. cities enacted regular blackouts to protect their citizens and industries from air and sea attacks, as Pearl Harbor proved that the oceans were no longer a reasonable barrier to attacks from other countries. This was brought to life even more as U.S. ships were sunk off the East Coast by German U-boats, sometimes as people watched from those very same beaches. The vast majority of Americans, no matter their race, religion, gender, or social status, stepped forward and committed themselves to winning the war. Minority groups that had been long treated as second-class citizens or less rose to the challenges in defense of the country as they had in World War I. However, simultaneously, many of these groups worked to remind Americans of the institutional injustices that existed among the minority communities. One such program became known as the Double V Campaign, which brought increased awareness of segregation not only within U.S. society, but within its industry and military. The double V stood for victory abroad and victory at home. We'll find that these civil rights groups, as they had done in the First World War, played off the war's propaganda as the country fought to maintain freedom and called the actions of the Nazis deplorable, yet failed to address similar behavior in the United States itself. As in World War I, American men enlisted or were drafted into the military, and women were once again called upon to fill the void left in industry. Rosie the Riveter came to represent the women who worked in the factories and the shipyards, ensuring the military remained well supplied and fed. These women were strong, independent, necessary, and positive in their portrayal. American women also served in the U.S. military, but in this war they were drawn in closer to the front lines and took on high-risk tasks. Organizations such as the Women's Army Corps, the WACs, served as the women's auxiliary branch of the United States Army, while the women accepted for volunteer emergency services, known as the WAVES, represented the United States Women's Naval Reserve, which saw women serving in forward combat medical facilities, as transport pilots, as mechanics, even as scientists, and sometimes even clerks. As the First World War, their accomplishments would create far more acceptance for increased civil liberties in American society for women. It is important to keep in mind that political power, economic control, and nationalism were not the only factors that fueled the Axis governments. For both Japan and Germany, racism played a significant role in their motivations. For Hitler's Germany, the Aryan race was viewed as the superior ethnic group of Europe, if not the world. The English, French, and Americans were comparable, but their tendency for interracial relations made them inferior to the Germans. At least this is what Hitler believed. Hitler also believed that the Eastern Europeans, like the Poles, the Czechoslovakians, and the people of the USSR, were considered subhuman, while the Jews were viewed as anything but human. And we'll find that for Hitler, his operations in Eastern Europe sought to create Lebensraum, or living space, for all Germans. For Japan, it promised the Asian nations that they would drive out Westerners and reverse the European influence throughout the region. Now, Japan sought to create a confederacy of Asian nations under the guidance of Japan itself. And this confederacy would be known as the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Japan, though, will soon follow in the path of Germany as it declared the Yamato race as the superior ethnic group in Asia. As Asia's so-called master race, the other Asian groups represented the quote-unquote auxiliary races, and the other countries around Asia were to be considered the guest races. It should be noted that this was all propaganda and was far from Japan's intentions, as they sought to gain total dominance throughout the region. And we're going to find that 10,000 Asians died under the control of Japanese forces between 1936 and 1945. So with this image, we kind of see how the United States is viewing their adversaries through the racial lens. Now, first, I'd like you to identify the artist. Many of you are going to know this individual, especially from your childhood and the numerous books that you read. But this image also shows representational differences between the two groups, the Germans and the Japanese. In the United States, the former conflicts between the Americans and the Axis powers formed the basis of its pro-war propaganda. Japanese Americans received more hatred than what was seen in relation to German Americans. Where there were said to be good and bad Germans, all Japanese were seen as a threat to the country. Anti-Oriental laws were renewed to once again prevent people of Asian descent from entering the country or having the freedom of assembly, travel, or civil protection. As time progressed, the Japanese Empire transcended from being presented as subhuman, incompetent, and deserving of little respect to a superhuman threat to America and the world. As Americans had difficulty separating the Asian ethnic groups, non-Japanese Americans were often caught up in the hatred. This was especially hard on Japanese Americans whose relatives in China were suffering the brunt of Japanese cruelty. As a direct result of wartime hysteria and racism following the attack on Pearl Harbor, in December of 1941, FDR ordered all Japanese financial assets in the United States frozen. 2 months later, the civil rights of Japanese citizens were suspended. And we'll find during the spring of 1942, 120,000 people of Japanese descent, primarily those along the West Coast, were interned as a result of Executive Order 9066. Despite the lack of evidence of widespread espionage or sabotage, families were given a limited time, in some cases hours, to prepare for their transfer to 10 camps in the deserts of California. The restrictions placed upon them meant that they could only bring what could fit in 2 suitcases per person or on their person themselves. All else was lost, including their homes, businesses, and any other property they could not carry. These things would never be returned to these Japanese citizens. Between 1940 and 1942, the United States grappled with the consequences of its earlier commitment to isolationism and its long-held principles regarding national defense. This greatly limited the needed resources to execute operations in the Pacific, leaving the U.S. Navy to conduct defensive operations and low-impact hit-and-run attacks. Japan's advanced aircraft, naval assets, and experienced servicemen overwhelmed the American military leadership and their troops throughout the Pacific, causing the loss of the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam within weeks. Across the world, before any major operations could be undertaken in Europe, the United States and England needed to secure control of the Atlantic Ocean in order to allow the free movement of supplies and personnel between the United States, England, and the Soviet Union. The battle for the Atlantic would require the United States and England to destroy the German U-boat threat to transport ships, which were nearly strangling England and the USSR of needed weapons, food, fuel, and other critical resources.